the assembly of the parliament, if you wish, it generated something without the property right. It generated a global idea. It generated democracy. So I may dare to say that 507 BC, globalization started. It's not a new phenomenon. And you all know me a little bit, but I wanted to tell you slightly how do I come to be the economist that this amazing man, my former boss, George Papandreou, brought in 2009 and made one person very happy, my father. I was missing in action for over 20 years. I am a person that studied economics and used a lot of the history and the Byzantine roots of both my parents coming from that part of the world, my engagement of having traveled and worked in different countries. And I studied neoclassical economics. And then I realized that part of neoclassical economics is rational expectation theory, right? Your favorite, Frank. And then I thought I was really irrational because I did not like the logic of rational expectations theory. I felt it was austere and it was squeezing absolutely everything in one mathematical model that did not incorporate history, trust, security, consciousness. What makes somebody want to succeed? How do you plug that in? And I started trying to model trust into our economic models at the time. It sounded very strange with my colleagues. It wasn't going down very well. But then slowly this can fit into what is known today institutional economics. So that's who I am. I'm an economic lingo and institutional economist. In reality, I'm a student of human behavior, using a lot of history to understand how humans operate and how social consciousness is generated. And I want to recognize all of you and say that we are all welcomed here by this aura and energy of this space. I'm not able to welcome anybody. Frank is able to welcome us because he represents part of that global universal space. And I want to thank and appreciate the thought leaders and scholars we invited today to partake in this conversation. And I would like to thank the Ministry of Culture and our two extraordinary ladies that right now are sitting back there taking notes. Y Pelagia y Maria Duru. Thank you very much for helping us. They were the two ladies that are safeguarding the 25th century of our history, and they were making sure we're going to be able to make this space appropriate for this event. I want to thank the representatives from the city of Athens, the representatives from the mayor of Sparta. Hey, we brought a Spartan in Athens. I'm a Spartan too, partly. He's a spy. Petros. The representative of the prefecture of Attica, Mr. Dimopoulos. I believe he's somewhere here. Thought leaders, Greek thought leaders, Hellenes, Mr. Mazis. Thank you for being here tonight. Economists that are thinking outside of the box. Michael Saris, you tried so hard to think out of the box, especially in your work in the World Bank and when you were in the Ministry of Finance in Cyprus. Mr. Sardelis, thank you for being a practitioner economist.
Still inside the box.
Entrepreneurs, thought leaders, thank you for being here today. Our amazing lawyers. Frank, how has democracy changed from 25 BC to today? How do you feel about the way today, I don't know, we use or we have evolved the idea of democracy?
So I'm not sure that, I'm not going to answer that question right away.
You're welcome to answer any question. This is what this is all about.
Because before you can talk about forms of government and institutions, I think you actually have to talk about human nature, because any institution is designed to deal with human beings as they actually are, and to organize them in societies in ways that they will behave predictably and produce order. And so one of the reasons that Plato, I think, is a great philosopher is that he begins with a discussion of human nature. So if you read the Republic, in the opening books, Socrates is talking to Glaucon and Adeimantus, and he says, okay, so we know that we have human beings with desire. You want a house, you know, you want a car, you want that steak dinner or something of that sort. So Glaucon says, yes, indeed, we all have desires. And then he also says we are also rational. We reason and we calculate about how to get that steak dinner. And we know that if the steak has been sitting outside for a couple of days, it's probably gone bad. And if you eat it, you're going to get very sick. And so even though you want the steak, you don't eat it because you're a rational human being. And so Glaucon and Adeimantus say, yes, that's the case. But then Socrates says, isn't there actually a third part of the soul? And he refers to a dog and then to a warrior. And he says, isn't there something about a warrior that gets angry when challenged, that distinguishes between friends and enemies? And this is the introduction in the Republic of the concept of thumos. Now, when I studied Greek, I knew that word, and I then learned that it's a word in modern Greek as well. So it means anger, pride. And I think that it's important to think about this concept for the following reason, that the modern economics Elena has talked about does not understand thumos.
No.
It doesn't, right? So the standard economic model is so-called rational utility maximization. So the utility just means desire, like we all want stuff. And usually economists think about this in terms of material goods. We want a big bank account, or we want that big house. And they say human beings are rational. So they got the first two parts of the human soul, the human psyche. But then there's this other part that has to do with pride. And what is pride and what is thumos based on? It is really based on recognition. That is to say, we don't just want material objects. We want the respect of other people. We want other people to say, yes, you have basic dignity. You are another human being. I treat you as another human being. And if we don't get that respect, what is the emotion we feel?
Disappointment.
Anger, right? We feel deeply angry. We feel resentful that I am not being respected. And so thumos is really the driver of resentment, of anger, and it's actually what drives a lot of people into politics. And I think this is not an original idea with me. The German philosopher Hegel actually argued that the whole of human history is really a struggle for recognition, that the French Revolution with the rights of man. What was that about? Well, it was about the fact that human beings wanted to be recognized. And how do you recognize them? You give them rights. You say, you have a right to life, you have a right to speak, you have a right to believe, and ultimately you'll have a right to participate in politics. And what happens when you don't give people that recognition? They get angry. So just to give you one example, if you remember Mohamed Bouazizi, right? He was the Tunisian vegetable seller back in 2011 who was slapped by a policewoman who confiscated his vegetable cart. He went to the mayor's office. He says, "Where's my cart?" And they wouldn't talk to him. And so in despair, he got some gasoline, poured it on his head, set himself on fire, and that was the origin of the Arab Spring. And then that led to this conflagration all across the Arab world. Why? Because people saw in that act a fundamental act of disrespect, right? An authoritarian ruler does not respect citizens. They do not have rights. They're not treated as a human being. A human being, at minimum, should at least get an answer. They say, "Where's my vegetable cart?" And you say, "Well, you know, you broke the law. We confiscated it. You'll get it back according to the law," so forth. That's the way you talk to a human being. But in a dictatorship, that doesn't happen, right? And I think the resonance of that anger is what drove the Arab Spring and these uprisings. You know, they did not lead to democracy, but I think that fundamentally democracy is about that. It is about equal respect and giving people equal respect. So this gets back to the economists, because the economists really understand the desire part and they understand the rationality part, but they don't necessarily understand the respect part and the way that this demand for respect can make people do things that are contrary to their self-interest, right? And so you think about something like Brexit, right? Why did people vote to leave the European Union? Well, a lot of Brexit voters were told by the people that wanted to remain in the EU that, you know, you're being really stupid. Everybody knows from basic trade economics that if you have a big market, you're all going to get rich. And you're walking away from one of the biggest markets in the world by leaving the EU. Don't you stupid people understand that you're not doing this in your self-interest? And I think that the reaction of many Brexit voters was twofold. First of all, they said, and actually I've heard people articulate this view, they said, "I don't care if we lose jobs and we suffer an economic setback. I think we need to take control of our country. There are too damn many foreigners coming into Britain. We have no control over this because of European institutions, and we want to be able to control our own country." The second thing they said is, "Who the hell are you to be speaking to me like I'm a stupid person that doesn't understand my own self-interest? You know, kind of Oxford, Cambridge educated, technocrat living in London with lots of job opportunities, where I'm sitting up here in Northern England, you know, out of a job because of outsourcing and so forth." And I think that this was the kind of gap in the logic that, you know, led to this upsurge over the past few years, was a respect gap. That a lot of working class people felt that their institutions, their government, was not respecting them, was not listening to them. You know, for example, you look at the expansion of the European Union, right? France and a couple of other countries, they're asked, "Do you want to sign the Maastricht Treaty or some other further expansion?" And the people say, "No, we don't want to do this." So what happens? They say, "Well, you know, you got it wrong, so let's vote again." And then they get the right answer, right? And, you know, it seems to me that that is that was a sign of the fact that many of the elites in Europe really felt that they understood better than ordinary people. And so this is a long way of getting to the question about democracy, because I actually think that Plato understood human nature better than modern economics does, right? Because Plato understood that there was this third part of the soul, thumos, that oftentimes drove people to act against their economic interests, right? A lot of Americans who voted for President Trump wanted to get rid of Obamacare, this Obama healthcare system, and they were the biggest beneficiaries of it, So it's really hard to understand what's going on, but they said Obamacare is one of those things that these elites thought up and they've imposed it on us, and we want to make our own decisions and not be told what's good for us. So in a sense, I think a lot of modern democracy are actually fights about recognition and about respect and about thumos. Gay marriage, right? Take another example. Gay marriage is spread all over the Western world like wildfire. What is the issue behind the demand that gays and lesbians have that they want to be married? It's not an economic one. I mean, there are economic issues involved, like if you're a gay couple and you have children and you want to have rights of survivorship, inheritance, and so forth. So that's a legal aspect that's important to people. But it can actually be taken care of in a civil union or something that you don't call marriage. There can be legal provisions to take care of those economic aspects. But what was really the issue was, gays and lesbians wanted to say, we want respect. We want to use the word marriage because we want the state and all of our friends and neighbors to recognize the fact that our union has just as much dignity as a union between a man and a woman. And conversely, the people that were opposed to gay marriage didn't want that equality because they said, the institution of marriage is sacred. It should be between a man and a woman, and we don't want to accord that same level of respect to a homosexual union as to a heterosexual union. And so a lot of the issues, I think that are roiling our democratic politics today are actually these things that arise out of thumos. And that's why I think these economic models are really not quite adequate to help us understand really what's driving a lot of our politics today. So I didn't explain how democracy has changed.
So basically, but basically you're saying that people feel that they're not represented. Some groups feel today that are not represented equally against the rights of democracy, and then they require or they ask for such. But why so? Why and how have we gotten there?
Well, so this gets into an issue that I talk about in my book, my last book, Identity, which really has to do with the concept of the modern self. In primitive societies, every teenager, wants to be able to do whatever the hell they want, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't understand why there are rules and why their parents tell them, no, you can't do so. So there's this constant tension between, individual desires and social rules. But in virtually every society, up until the point of really about 500 years ago in the West, the moral rules were on the side of society, right? Everybody said, no, you may want to go off and marry this person that, you've fallen in love with, but we're telling you, you have to marry the people, the person that we tell you you're going to marry. And then you have this sudden change in Western thought about a hidden self, this idea that actually what's inside me is really what's important and what's authentic. And it's this bad society around me that is keeping me from expressing that inner self. And it's related again to thumos, because what are you proud of? Maybe you're proud of your possessions, the nice Mercedes in your garage, but ultimately the things that make you the most proud are this feeling that I'm a human being with certain qualities that should be respected, and other people aren't respecting me. And it's that inner self that is more important than the external rules that are being set by the rest of society. And if you think about the balance between that inner self and the outer social rules, they've been completely upended, right? That most people no longer think, well, society is always right. You know, you're going to have to conform whether you like it or not. This idea of individualism, that I've got this hidden self, and that's what needs to be supported by everyone else, is now, you know, everybody believes some form of that. And I think many of the social movements that have arisen, you know, just take something like nationalism, right? Why did the Germans unify in the 19th century? You have all these German-speaking people scattered all over Central and Eastern Europe. They don't have their own state, and they feel inside, I may be, you know, I may live in the Rhineland, I'm actually under the control of the French or, you know, some other petty prince, but I'm really a German. And I need to live in my own country that's represented by, you know, that represents me and other Germans. And I think modern nationalism is another example, or Catalonia today. I mean, if you don't want to take a 19th century example, a lot of Catalans, you know, a couple of generations ago were content to think of themselves as Spaniards, but no longer, because they've got a separate language, a separate history, and it's that hidden self that's been repressed that, you know, is driving the demand for separate recognition of Catalonia. And so, you know, that's another way in which this modern understanding of the importance of the authentic self is a big driver of a lot of our political movements today.
And how do you, this is open, by the way, this is not supposed to be just me and Frank, because we can do this
so anybody that wants to.
me and Frank have been like debating this for a very long time, and we will continue doing so. So I'll be happy to hear Nick, for instance, who is working on identity issues, to tell us his questions. But my question to you is more associated to, of course, there is a part of me that says, when did Θυμός come out? Like, I'm interested in finding out why this holistic definition of dignity was broken and when. But this is a bit of a research question. But it would be an interesting answer to get, because if we get that answer, then we know what went wrong at some point, if something went wrong, or how did evolution of humankind occur that decided to separate Θυμός away. But if we can talk through that and then touch upon the since we're living and sitting in a European soil and Greece, how did this modern definition touch the Greek land that we're sitting on right now and the Greek economy? So would you like to, do you know, do you have a, do you have an idea why Θυμός moved away or something?
There's a lot you can say about how Θυμός develops over time. You know, if you actually go back to the Republic and you read Plato, although Socrates suggests that everybody has this Θυμός inside them, the only people in his society that are recognized are warriors. You know, it's the guardian class, the people that risk their lives on behalf of the community. And this is true in every aristocratic society, that a shopkeeper or a peasant or, you know, a carpenter doesn't have dignity. It's only the aristocrats that are awarded status and recognition by their society. It's a hierarchical society. In my view, so the evolution of this, actually, a lot of it has to do with Christianity, because, you know, with the introduction of...
That's why we brought a priest here.
Yes.
He will tell you all about Christianity as well.
But, you know, in Christian doctrine, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, And as a result of that, they see that they're naked, and they basically acquire moral choice. Previously, they were like children, they were innocent, but all of a sudden, they make this bad decision, they commit the original sin, but it gives them a moral status that they didn't have before. And so I think, you know, in the Christian religion, there is this idea that every one of us may make wrong decisions, but we are moral agents. You know, we have that ability. And I think that's the basis for our understanding of dignity. You know, as the Enlightenment happened and the world began to secularize, that sense of our having dignity because we are moral agents is no longer just a Christian doctrine. It becomes secularized in thinkers like Rousseau and Kant and so forth. And today, I think we would say that everybody has dignity. The disabled person has dignity. You know, an African has dignity, a woman has dignity, disabled people, and so forth. And so you've had this broad expansion of, you know, the circle of people that are human beings that have an equal claim on respect and dignity by their society. Now, I haven't gotten to Greece.
No,
So,
but I have a question from our former UK ambassador to Greece, David Lansman, who is now sitting in London, and we talked all about Brexit, and he's saying, Elena, does the lack of respect come from an abuse of meritocracy today?
mhm.
Just because I have a couple of degrees, it doesn't mean I should set the rules. So this has something to do about the fact that, if I understand it correctly, that we have kind of royalized the technocrats, and we have royalized, and especially recently we've gone through that, and royalized the fact that because they know they have, you know, technical knowledge, therefore they know how to set rules, laws, regulations, and we assume, and here is my friend. I like to call you my boss. You used to be my boss once upon a lifetime. George Papandreou, who suffered, who went through like 1,000 deaths trying to explain to technocrats the Greek pride and the Greek soul and the Greek conscience. And yes, of course, there have been abuses of the state historically, but we can't just really squeeze everything because a rational expectation, which wasn't even economists, by the way. Technocrats are not economists. I don't know what they are. They're bureaucrats with a lot of degrees. So how about that? George, do you want to also make a question? You'll get there, yeah.
No, I mean, I think in response to the ambassador's question, yes, I think that one of my colleagues at Stanford, a political scientist, did a very interesting study to show that the single factor that determines whether you vote either for a liberal candidate or for a populist candidate, you know, Hillary Clinton on the one hand or Donald Trump on the other, is population density. And that's a proxy, I think, really for education, right? That people that live in big metropolises, you know, in Athens or London or Chicago or San Francisco, you know, tend to be better educated. They've got those degrees. They benefit from the global economy. They have lots of job opportunities. They can travel. They're cosmopolitan. And the populist voters, you know, live in smaller cities and towns out in the countryside. They don't have access to those advantages. And, you know, this is something I find a lot of my educated friends simply don't get, is that they also feel quite resentful being told by their more educated, you know, fellow citizens that they're stupid or racist or xenophobic or, you know, something else to explain why they, you know, why they made the choices.
Why they made the choices, yes. So maybe we want to move a bit on the Greek side, and have you, yeah, I'm looking at Mr. Mazis as well, our great political scientist, on the Greek side, and try to explain and understand from from your perspective, from the two amazing books you wrote, The Political Order and
Political Decay.
Political Decay. What happened to the evolution? It still fits into the same question. What happened to the evolution of democracy? Okay, so what happened to the modern Greek society? How does, if we take a snapshot, an X-ray today, how does it look like?
Okay, so this is the point where I start to get in trouble.
They're like 30 seconds, and it takes 35 hours to get an answer. It's okay.
Okay, so this is the part that I feel really uncomfortable when I travel to a country and start trying to describe, your society to you, because that's the kind of arrogance which can easily get me into really big trouble. But let me just, I'll try, and you can tell me if I'm wrong and why I'm wrong, all right? So it does seem to me that one of the big problems in the Greek political order and with Greek democracy is a really deep distrust of the state, right? And not just the state, but it seems to me there's also a kind of broader general social distrust of other people. And this is an issue that I've discussed with other people just on this trip. That for example, most Greek businesses are family businesses. They're very small family businesses, and the question is, why don't these businesses grow and then corporatize and get external shareholders and hierarchy of professional managers and so forth? And by the way, this is not just Greece where this happens. It's true in southern Italy. It's true in parts of China. The answer that's given by a lot of sociologists is this lack of trust, that people don't have a trust of other strangers where they would let them into a family business in a way that they would eventually take over the running of the business, and the family would lose control. But that's what's necessary for economic growth. And so that distrust is, quite pervasive. Southern Italy is famous for distrust, where you don't have any social organizations. You have a very weak civic culture. Basically, people are kind of confined to their families as the main social unit. They're nuclear families, because they have a hard time trusting people on the outside. And so then if you go into Greek history, you say, well, why is the level of distrust higher than in, I don't know, Denmark or Norway or the Netherlands or some other place? And there, I think, there's a lot of historical reasons for this. So one of them is the fact that Greece was not ruled by Greeks for many years, right? It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so the inclination to evade taxes was a perfectly reasonable response to the fact that your overlords are these Turks that are sitting there and taking all the money back to Istanbul, right? And then you become independent 2 centuries ago, and then you get this Bavarian king imposed on you by the French and the Germans and everybody else. And so it seems to me in your history, there's been a real disconnect between ordinary citizens and their state, their government, that contributes, then it leads to this vicious cycle where, because you don't have a modern state, modern and effective state, people evade taxes, they don't want to give the state authority, and then that kind of locks you into a bad equilibrium where it feeds the distrust that was really the cause of the weak state in the first place.
So then in Greece, we end up having, as you said to me, this is a private conversation, but we had a private conversation before the private conversation. So Frank said to me, in Greece, Elena, we seem to have gone with first have established democracy and then the state. And as a result, we kind of like lost the sequence, or we created a sequence that wasn't sequenced. So we kind of like jumped. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
So this is something I talked about it at some length in my book on political order, where the sequence by which you create institutions is really important to their success. And if you think about, so what are the countries around the world that have really modern, powerful states, right? So you've got Germany, France, Britain, Japan. All of these countries have well-trained bureaucrats. There's an academy, the ENA, the École Nationale d'Administration in France is an elite school that is designed to train senior bureaucrats. You have very system set up in Germany. The reform of Oxford and Cambridge was really in order to have well-educated bureaucrats that could run the British state, and this all happened in the 19th century. In every one of those countries, this reform took place under authoritarian conditions. Before there was democracy, these countries did this. Like the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon and in 1806, and they said to themselves, if we don't get a modern state, an effective modern state, we're going to keep losing to the French, and we can't tolerate that. And so they create, a modern German bureaucracy in the first half of the 19th century before they became a democracy. Whereas in Greece's case, the sequence was actually, it was also very similar to Italy, where you had an expansion of democracy before that modern state was created. Actually, in European history, the franchise was expanded in Greece before Italy, before France, before Britain even. And so you had more democracy at an early point, but before you had a modern state, and the result was that politicians vying for votes would use access to the state, would use state jobs as a form of patronage. This is a classic thing that happens in many, many societies.
And then there is, I recognize what you're saying, and I don't want to go much further into this because I don't know much about it, or what I know, it's not my science. I can tell you how can we restructure debt, right? I can do that, but not tonight. But Mr. Mazis has a question, Professor Mazis has a question, but maybe I will be able to also add into that question. We have a period in Greece and Italy maybe that is kind of like lost, because we did have also an authoritarian period of the Byzantine Empire. And during that period, we created the first university ever in the West. But then something happened and it crumbled. And I'm not asking that you, I'm asking that Mr. Mazis. Something happened and all of it crumbled. And suddenly we were nothing. And maybe this is what it occurs, when you're like completely big and you become an empire. And then, and it's a funny empire, the Byzantine Empire, because it is not an empire that initiated with an intention of becoming a Greek empire. It's a Roman Empire that it slowly, the Greek language penetrates it and takes over, and then Christianity penetrates it, and because it has the Greek language in it, and it seems to be like the Greek kind of religion, it penetrates it as well. But then something happens. I really don't know the answer to it, but since we're in a close group, I thought of bringing it out. And Professor Mazis, would you like to, maybe you want to stand so the camera can see you. If θέλετε ίσως να σηκωθείτε. Πώς είναι, παιδιά, με την κάμερα, καλά? Οκ, μιλήστε όπως είσαστε πιο άνετα.
Καταρχάς ήθελα να πω...
Δεν ακούγεστε πολύ καλά. We need the translator for Professor Fukuyama. Παιδιά, χρειαζόμαστε ένα μεταφραστή για τον κύριο Φουκουγιάμα, γιατί μιλάει στα ελληνικά ο κύριος Μάζης.
Καταρχάς να ευχαριστώ και εσένα, Έλενα, και τον καθηγητή για την εξαιρετική αυτή βραδιά.
First one, thank you very much.
Και να ξεκινήσω από μια αγαπημένη για τους Έλληνες μέθοδο, τη μεευτική.
Oh no, how do I translate that one? And I want to thank you very much for the usage of a dialectic method of Do you use that Do you use that word?
It's okay.
Socratic method of maietics, getting out of the person.
Thank you.
Ας το πούμε λοιπόν αλλιώς, να βάλουμε μερικούς ορισμούς κάτω και να βασισμένοι σε αυτούς τους ορισμούς να δούμε πώς μπορούμε να πλησιάσουμε τα πολύ σημαντικά θέματα τα οποία θέσει ο καθηγητής. Δεν ξέρω αν μ' ακούτε.
So he wants to ask a few questions that are associated. Perfect, thank you. And I'm sitting.
Ο πρώτος ορισμός, ο οποίος έγινε και θέμα συζητήσεως και στο Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών, ήταν όταν με ρώτησαν κάποιοι συνάδελφοι τι εννοείται, κύριε συνάδελφε, με τον όρο ελληνισμός. Ναι, δεν σας κρύβω ότι σοκαρίστηκα, αλλά τους είπα το εξής. Αν επιθυμούν να τους δώσω έναν μαρξιστικό ορισμό για τον ελληνισμό. Το βρήκαν εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρον και τους είπα ότι ελληνισμός είναι η ελληνική γραμματεία, τα ελληνικά ήθη, έθιμα και παραδόσεις και η μνήμη που συνδέει όλα τα ανωτέρω με συγκεκριμένους γεωγραφικούς χώρους. Αυτός λοιπόν ήταν ένας ορισμός ο οποίος θα μπορούσε να εφαρμοστεί για οποιοδήποτε άλλο έθνος. Τον γερμανισμό, τον γαλλισμό, τον φραγκισμό, όποιο θέλετε. Το δεύτερο το οποίο έρχεται να δέσει με αυτό, να συμπληρώσει, είναι ότι ξέρετε η Ιερουσαλήμ, η Αθήνα, η Ρώμη είναι πόλεις οι οποίες έχουν ένα πολιτισμικό αποτύπωμα της τάξεως μέσες άκρες των 3.000 ετών. Αυτό το πολιτισμικό αποτύπωμα βασίζεται σε όλα αυτά τα οποία ανέφερα, στη γλώσσα, στη γραμματεία, στα ήθη, στα έθιμα, στις παραδόσεις. Επειδή διάβασα πολύ προσεκτικά το θαυμάσιο βιβλίο σας, κύριε συνάδελφε, θέλω να σας συγχαρώ για την ειλικρίνεια την οποία διαπίστωσα ότι έχετε σχετικά με την περίπτωση των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών. Είπατε ότι γράφετε μέσα ότι είναι ένα κράτος που βασίστηκε στη μετανάστευση. Διαμορφώνει αυτό το οποίο πολύ σωστά ονομάζεται νέα εθνική συνείδηση, σαν συνισταμένη πολλών πολιτισμικών συνιστοσών, οι οποίες σιγά σιγά βρήκαν τη θέση τους, χωρίς η μία να μπορεί να διεκδικήσει κάποιο προνόμιο από τις άλλες. Στην Ελλάδα όμως δεν είναι τα ίδια τα πράγματα. Το τύπωμα της χώρας είναι τεράστιο.
Δεν ακούγεται καλά το μικρόφωνο.
Αυτό λοιπόν το οποίο ρώτησε προηγουμένως η κυρία Παναρίτη, ότι ξαφνικά το Βυζάντιο δέχεται τις ελληνικές επιρροές, μα δέχεται τις ελληνικές επιρροές στο Βυζάντιο, όπως δέχεται σήμερα η ανθρωπότητα τις αγγλοσαξονικές επιρροές. Όταν έχεις έναν υλικό πολιτισμό υψηλού επίπεδου και παράλληλα ένα πνευματικό πολιτισμό υψηλού επίπεδου, που σημαίνει και κοινωνική τοποθέτηση στις τότε διαστρωματώσεις τις κοινωνικές, είναι φυσικό ότι το γλωσσικό σου όργανο θα υπερισχύσει. Έτσι λοιπόν το Βυζάντιο γίνεται ελληνικό. Όχι με την έννοια που θα έδινε ένας σοβινιστής, τονίζω, και όχι εθνικιστής.
Παιδιά, στο μικρόφωνο δεν ακούγεται καλά του κυρίου Μάζη.
Θα σας διαβάσω δύο ορισμούς. Δεν θα σας πω ποιος ορισμός είναι ποιανού όρου. Πρώτος ορισμός, το διαβάσω αγγλικά. An aggressive and unreasonable belief that one's own country is better than all others. Αυτός είναι ο ένας ορισμός. Ο δεύτερος ορισμός, δεν λέω τον όρο επίτηδες, είναι a strong feeling of love and pride in one's own country compare patriotism, a desire for political independence by a notion that is controlled by another or is part of another. Αν ρωτήσω λοιπόν έτσι ρητορικά, τι ακριβώς εκπροσωπεί ο πρώτος ορισμός, τον εθνικισμό? Οι περισσότεροι μπορεί να μου λέγανε ναι. Λοιπόν όχι. Το πανεπιστημιακό λεξικό της Οξφόρδης, το πρώτο ορισμό τον βάζει για να ορίσει τον σοβινισμό. Εμείς τι έχουμε κάνει? Εσχάτως. Έχουμε μεταφέρει την σημασία του σοβινισμού, του όρου σοβινισμός, στον όρο εθνικισμός. Η Οξφόρδη δεν συμφωνεί, ούτε κι εγώ.
Η ερώτησή σας είναι αυτή?
Η ερώτηση λοιπόν είναι, όχι, η ερώτηση είναι τοποθέτηση, δεν είναι
τοποθέτηση, ναι.
Η τοποθέτησή μου λοιπόν είναι ότι αυτού του είδους τα πολιτισμικά αποτυπώματα πρέπει να γίνονται σεβαστά. Εδώ είναι ένα άλλο είδος dignity. Και όσο για τον Μπουαζίζη, επειδή ακριβώς είναι η δουλειά μου να ασχολούμαι με τη γεωπολιτική, να κοιτάξουμε κατά πόσον είναι σωστή η ερμηνεία του φαινομένου της αραβικής λεγόμενης ανοίξεως, γιατί εγώ τότε, θυμούνται οι περισσότεροι, είχα πει ότι this is not an Arab Spring, is an Islamist winter. Και βγήκα σωστός. Τότε όμως μου λέγανε ότι, ξέρετε, μήπως υποστηρίζετε απολυταρχικά καθεστώτα. Και βεβαίως ο καημένος τι έλεγα, εγώ καραμαλικός είμαι ρε παιδιά. Δεν έχω καμιά σχέση με όλα. Άρα λοιπόν είναι πολύ πιο πολύπλοκο το θέμα και τελειώνω με αυτό. Θα υποσχεθώ στον καθηγητή, αν έχει την καλοσύνη, του χρόνου τέτοιο καιρό να του στείλω ένα πλήρες σχόλιο του βιβλίου του, στα αγγλικά βεβαίως, και αυτό κάνει ό,τι θέλει.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to make a comment because there are several other questions, or?
Well, let me have a very, yeah. So on your first point, I completely agree that nationalism does not have to be chauvinistic, and that people have a legitimate sense of pride in their history and culture, and that, you know, this is a basis of community, and that's very important. So it's important to distinguish between a chauvinistic, aggressive, exclusionary sense of your community and one that is based on cultural achievement and, you know, other historical legacies, right? In fact, I think that it's important for any democracy to have a sense of itself as a community, a sense of strong national identity. On the Arab Spring question, I think that there were many different trends in the Arab world, some of which were Islamist, some of which were violently Islamist, and some of them were liberal. And in 2011, I think it would have been hard to know, you know, exactly which one of those trends would necessarily have won out. But I don't think that it was obvious that, you know, the worst forms and the most extreme forms of Islamism would ultimately come to prevail. And I would look forward to a detailed commentary on my book, you know, when you have the chance to send it. So thank you.
And now, Michael Saris, our good friend, and a true economist. Please, you can talk to about them.
I'd like, if I could, for a moment, to connect us with present-day reality. Hello, can you hear me now?
There is too much wind, so I'm coming here to take care of the wind.
If Θυμός and mistrust of government is the dominating feature now of human relations, we are in trouble, because in dealing with the pandemic and its aftermath and the problems that it brought to the surface, the government is now cast in a very key role, something that until recently we were very suspicious of. We all thought that markets would solve everything, but we now know that we need government to take charge, not just for investments, but in also to lead the way to a new paradigm.
Right.
How do we rebuild this trust? Of course, government has to be competent also, and there we have an issue. But then, even if it is competent and nobody trusts it, we get nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
How can we begin rebuilding this trust, you know, defeating Θυμού, as you said?
Well, that's a really good question, and the answer is very difficult. But I do think that trust in government is kind of an ideological thing, or it has been. So when Reagan and Thatcher came to power in the late 70s and early 80s, they brought with them a kind of anti-government ideology, you know, where they said the state only gets in the way of economic growth. It's a constraint on entrepreneurs, and they always overregulate. And I think that that led to the education of a couple of generations of young people who, you know, had a kind of reflexive suspicion of government and hostility to it. But I do think that that may be one of the effects of the pandemic, is to show people that actually governments are pretty important, and that they're not always getting in the way of society, but sometimes they do necessary things. And I think that would be an important shift. But there are several other factors. So one of them is the internet, right? That the effectiveness of government can be undermined by distrust, you know, deliberate distrust. And one of the things that's happened with the internet is that you've got alternative sources of information, some of it put there deliberately and weaponized by hostile powers or by people in your own society that want to undermine you. And one of the, I think, very dangerous things that we're facing right now is that we don't have a consensus over basic factual information. So right now in the United States, 1/3 of Americans think that Donald Trump won the last election by a landslide, and that the Democrats just stole the election in a fraudulent, you know, in a big fraud. And it's not true, but they believe it because, you know, there is not the kind of filters on information that there had been. And then you got the Russians that deliberately want to increase distrust. And so I think we face a lot of challenges, and I honestly don't have a solution to that. Because it's a new challenge, I think, and it's one we're really going to have to wrestle with in the coming years.
Is anybody that wishes to have Peter? Petros. I'm sorry, Mariniki, we're moving you from... So Sparta has a comment to make. The Peloponnesian War, you know, it lasted several... How many years? 50, 130? Only 30? And it was only, the truce was only signed with Mayor Abramopoulos in 1995 or 6 or something like that, after Christ. Did you know that? The truce, the real truce of the Peloponnesian War was only signed in 1995. Anyway, the Athenian first.
We won the Peloponnesian War, and most allies of Sparta asked the Spartans to completely destroy Athens because they had enough of Athens. They were too aggressive, too imperialist. And the Spartans indeed said, no, they were great allies for so many years against the Persians, and we will leave the city intact and reinstitute democracy. So it was a very nice moment after the Peloponnesian War. My question to you is the following. It seems, for example, that the Chinese government is now going to follow all the activity in social media of every Chinese citizen and issue merits and demerits. You have merits for good behavior and demerits for bad behavior. Are we moving into some sort of definitive Orwellian society where everything will be monitored and you have to be always politically correct? The money you spend will always be registered because you won't have cash. It's going to be all some sort of credit card, so everybody will know your every movement. And in the end, you will pretty much conform with the norms and won't allow much craziness or madness or chaos in the society, which is the salt of the society as well. Who wants to have 1 million of the same of us or what have you?
Well,
And congratulations to yourself, Eleni, for organizing things.
Oh my
Amazing,
God.
and many, many thanks. Well
No,
done.
we did it together. It was his idea.
so
And I just organized it.
So I hate to tell you, but that surveillance society exists already. A lot of people don't realize this, but Google has a master database that knows all the email. If you use the Chrome browser, it knows every email you've sent. It knows every website that you visited. It actually knows where you had lunch yesterday if you use Google Maps. And they've combined all of this data into a single record that now covers, several hundred million people around the world. What's different about China is the government is running that database, but in the West, it's these big private companies that have that kind of detailed information. And I think you're right that it opens up the possibility of a degree of surveillance that was simply not possible using big data. The other thing that I think artificial intelligence has done is to give a premium to size. The PC revolution was great because it put computing power on everyone's desk, and then you got smartphones and everybody's got a powerful computer in their pocket. But with AI, all of a sudden, it's big companies and big countries that can process massive amounts of data and use it to control the behavior in the West of customers and in China of citizens. And it's a big problem. Totalitarian societies in the 20th century tried to do this with the technologies of the 20th century, and they couldn't do it. But it's possible that they will succeed with the new generation of tech. I guess that the only thing I would say that's optimistic is that people won't like this. They won't like being spied on in this fashion. And I do think that there will probably be countermeasures that will come up that will allow people to guard their privacy better. I hope so, because I think we're going to be pretty uncomfortable in this new world.
It seems that people get upset about all this. Well, of course, everybody does. You don't like to be spied. That's why we didn't like our parents tell us, I know exactly what you've done and where you are. Is this your time, George? Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Hello?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Well, great to be here on this great conversation. One question and one comment. China data is controlled by the government. US data is controlled by massive big companies. Europe is fighting to see if we as citizens can control our own data.
Oh.
We haven't yet done that or done it effectively, but we're trying in that direction. But is it not a question of how we can use this new technology also for our democracy, in strengthening a democracy, rather than strengthening the concentration of power? And can we see, going back to ancient Greece, that maybe we need to complement, if not substitute, representative democracy with a more participative type of democracy, more deliberative type of democracy, which would maybe highlight the issue of dignity and trust and recognition of citizens being part of owning the process of decision making, and particularly if we think about this huge transition we have to go through towards a green economy, towards a sustainable economy. I can see that this will be very difficult if we don't get people along with us, all those who believe in the need to transit to this. And so that's one question, and I think we can maybe use algorithms. I've made a proposal I wrote an article about can we have a fourth branch of government, sort of a deliberative branch using the internet, and rather than it being with Facebook or Google or something like that, why not have it under, let's say, a parliament or a congress or something? Second, a comment, very much agree with your book. When you described the previous book, you described Italy and Greece on clientelism and patronage, and the fact that the state is weak. And actually, the crisis we had in Greece 10 years ago, the financial crisis, and it wasn't the first of the many financial crises we have had, was, I believe, much more, it wasn't just overspending, it was the fact that we did not have the institutions to check the power of a particular government, or maybe a series of governments, but I would say a particular government, the way that the money was used and lost through clientelistic, I call it clientelistic capitalism. But maybe we're moving to this kind of clientelistic capitalism in many other parts of the world too, where capitalism is, well, politics is captured by very strong concentrated power and wealth, and then it's, you know, helping out your friends, helping out your maybe your voters, some of your voters, but it's lost the idea of the rule of law and some sense of social justice and social and distribution, equal distribution is lost. And this inequality, of course, is creating this demagoguery, which I like is a better word than populism. But anyway, that's just a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So just on the last point, I'm a little bit skeptical about. So there's no question that the technology can be used for good purposes. It's good for mobilization. It's good for political organization. It's good for informing voters. And I think we've seen the results of better informed, more involved citizens as a result of the internet. And so there's no question that that's the case. The part that I'm a little bit skeptical about, though, is whether we necessarily want to try to increase citizen participation in all times and all places. And the reason I say that is because that desire is built on, I think, a false assumption, which is that ordinary citizens have the time, knowledge, and desire to actually inform themselves about public policy issues, complex public policy issues, and then actually participate. And I think actually some of the things that have been done to increase participation have led to bad outcomes because not everybody wants to participate. Who participates? It is these powerful interest groups that have a lot of money and really care. They're the ones that show up. And the reason that we're so polarized in the United States, one of the big reasons is that we moved to popular primaries where the only people that vote in a primary are activists, either on the far left or the far right. And that explains the rise of the Tea Party, and Bernie Sanders benefited from that, and so forth. So there's some issues with it.
Could we think about the citizens' assemblies and the lottery?
Yeah, so there's definitely, we have a center on deliberative democracy at Stanford that actually promotes, reasoned discussion by informed ordinary citizens. And that's something that's doable, and I think that's a model that can be replicated. Can you remind me, the first part of your question was about?
So that was the question was about
how
we can use the internet, or
yeah.
And I know the work.
No, but before that you had another.
Then I had we talked about the data and so on, and basically how we're going to get society with us in this big transition towards the green economy. And the other one was basically on the clientelistic capitalism, the clientelistic, which you described very well about Italy and Greece.
Yeah, well, unfortunately,
there have been sort of waves of push for reform in Greece over. It's been a fight between this clientelistic and more organized state over the past 2 centuries.
So unfortunately, you're really true.
Which is what, well, he suffered it firsthand, let me tell you that.
Yeah. So in the United States, we have become more clientelistic. First of all, as a result of money in politics, a large part of the government is actually captured by large, lobbying groups and powerful, economic sectors, and they write the legislation. And because they've got that kind of influence, the policies don't really reflect citizen interest in many cases. And then, someone like Donald Trump comes along and makes it infinitely worse. And so, there's only one. You may be familiar with the fact that there's only one big tunnel going between New Jersey and New York and Manhattan in New York City. That is about 100 years old and is leaking and very decrepit. And so there was a big plan to spend, I don't know, $7-8 billion to build a second modern tunnel to connect those two states. Donald Trump becomes president. He doesn't like all the Democrats, Chuck Schumer and Andrew Cuomo in New York State, so he cuts the project off, and then he doesn't want to pay for wildfire relief in California because that's another blue state that's being run by Democrats. And so it's classic clientelism that is taking root in the U.S. today.
I'm looking around. Nikos. Nikos had a question. He brought the question
Hello.
to me
Yes.
earlier
Oh, yes.
on
Okay.
nationalism.
I'm going to try to stand. Yes,
It
well,
happens to all of us,
thank you
yeah.
very much to Elena for organizing this, and thank you for this talk and for the occasion to discuss the ideas of your book. I want to go back to what you said in the beginning and also the topic of your previous work that I'm sure most of the people have followed. And this is basically the following. You mentioned the idea of Θυμός and of the need for recognition, and you mentioned Hegel. And of course, the hope of Hegel and of most of us is that we'd find some institution that gets to an equilibrium, a kind of recognition that ensures peace. And Hegel thought that he got it. And we thought that the state had this kind of provided some recognition that allowed also for civil society to function and for private life and the family to function. All these things would somehow create some kind of equilibrium. We thought that post Cold War nation states based on some civic nationalism, to go back to the previous idea, somehow got it right. And now flash forward, it seems to me, after reading your book, we're not so sure.
Yeah.
Needs for recognition seem to be coming from everywhere, either in the form of identity politics, in the form of white nationalism, populism, and we felt kind of lost. Which institutions should we try to strengthen? Where should we place our hope? How do you see things?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think that the problem is that the universal recognition that Hegel, supported. I mean, it's basically the rights of man, the rights in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are very important to people if they're living under a dictatorship, right? And if they have a very vivid memory of what it's like to have a government that throws you in jail arbitrarily, doesn't give you access to information, so on and so forth. But if you live in a democratic society that's peaceful, where there's economic growth, you're pretty much taken care of, you begin to forget about how bad the alternatives are. Correct. And I sort of think that that's what's happening in the world right now. Take Poland, right? So Poland right now is run by this Law and Justice Party that is populist. They're very resentful of Brussels. They hate, certain liberal innovations like gay marriage and so forth. Why is it that the Poles are upset about stuff like this? Because it's actually pretty trivial stuff. They were living under a communist dictatorship, until 1989. But the vast majority of Poles today were born after communism. They have no memory of what it was like to live in a dictatorship where they didn't have the basic rights that the European Union, promotes and grants them. And so it's easy for them to get complacent, and they take democracy for granted, and then they can complain about Brussels and the fact that their food is labeled in a funny way, or they have to obey rules that they, make them uncomfortable, this sort of thing. So I sort of think that it's exactly right that those basic rights are not enough over time, and that people want recognition of other things that make them different from people and not just this universal citizenship.
If I may add, the Cold War finished, and then we question if indeed history ended in the way Hegel had suggested, yeah? But really, what I would ask is whether or not the institutions that were put in place to hold on to the Cold War's reality, did they really wake up and smell the coffee? And did they see the Cold War end? So I would actually ask the question, did the Cold War institutions see their last day on the day of the Charlie, when they picked up Checkpoint Charlie up in Germany? And I'm afraid that if you look around and you check the Bretton Woods organizations that were built pretty much to hold on to what was going on at the time, including the OECD, NATO, all of these things are still Zunke Vasilevun, as we say in my beautiful mother country. They live and survive still, but they do go through identity crisis themselves as well. I think they have not found their identity yet, because I don't think they want to let go. So that's probably a point to think about as to how human identity has evolved together with democracy into these organizations and institutions. And then which one comes now first and second? Oh, please, Mr. Dendrinos, Professor.
Thank you again for a wonderful event. I would like to reflect on one
Professor Dendrinos is a professor of Hellenic Studies in the UK.
I'm not a professor, I'm just a doctor.
You're just a doctor, okay.
And what I wanted to say is that I was taught by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Kostas Kalimdzis, who has penetrated, I think, in Aristotelian thought for all his life, that one of the basic principles for human happiness is citizenship. In the ancient Greece is the concept of citizenship and of political friendship. Perhaps the solution to many questions about our modern world can be addressed having in mind these two principles. There are multiple identities. For example, as Elena said, I'm Greek. I'm also a Byzantine.
Αφροδίτη είναι εκείνα τα αστεράκια που βλέπετε αριστερά σας, που πολύ σπάνια είναι ακριβώς το ένα δίπλα στο άλλο και φαίνονται σαν ένα. Thank you, Elena.
Wow, this is amazing. I'm going to say something before you respond. Pedro. Francis is not a policy maker. He's not a technocrat. You will never hire him to tell you what the best law should be, or will he actually ever get engaged into writing one. Not that he cannot do it, but he has enough pride for himself to not want to be involved in this. But I want to say something about our two commentators that come from active politics. You can see that it's interesting to talk about, and also former politician, interesting to talk about our theories and our energies and our philosophies and you know, constellations of the stars. But every day people have to get paid. The state has to work, whether it is a city-state, and somebody has to handle a crisis that is just like a boiling egg in their hands. And that is really where I think we cut corners. That's where I think we end up not really using our theory that we have been educated with when we are applied at the end to where we are asked to apply it.
Well, since you asked for one thing I would do, in the United States, the one thing I would do is change our electoral system to ranked choice voting. We currently have a first-past-the-post voting system, a plurality system where the candidate that gets the most votes wins the election. And if we move to an Australian-type ranked choice system, it's sometimes called instant runoff, I think that would do a lot to reduce the polarization in the United States. But that's a kind of, you know, technical issue.
So we have, let's have, Mihaly.
Okay, a quick question, if I may, about relations between China and the United States. Sometimes people think back to the Peloponnesian War and talk about the Thucydides trap, which means that one established state and another state trying to challenge fight, and when elephants fight, the grass gets stepped on like the people of Milos. Where do you think this potential conflict? Now, we all know that we only have now one form of capitalism, one in China and one everywhere else with different political systems, but at some point, this tension could boil over. How do you see it coming out, and how can we try to avert a possible bad outcome?
Well, I think that competitive situation is there now. And I think it's because of this fundamental difference in fundamental political values between not just China and the United States, but between China and all, you know, other democratic countries. And I don't think we should kind of brush that aside or you know, minimize the differences. But it does not need to lead to war. And I think, you know, with a little bit of statesmanship, it won't. But there is a very dangerous trigger right now, which is Taiwan, because the Chinese have said very clearly that they want to reabsorb Taiwan within the decade, and they will do it by military means if that's necessary. And I think if you're asking where could a conflict come from, you know, that's where it's going to be.
Pano? I think it's working.
Is it working now? Yeah. So I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read the last book, unfortunately. I didn't get enough advance notice, Elena. You know,
Sorry,
that's
it's
why.
my fault.
But I did read your previous book. It's been 6 or 7 years ago, and the explanation around why clientelism took heavy root in countries like Greece and in areas such as southern Italy, and it did not in countries such as the United Kingdom and the US, made a great impression on me. And if I recall correctly, it's been 6 or 7 years now, but part of the explanation was that the new productive classes, the up-and-coming classes, were either, in the case of the countries that actually became less clientelistic, either took a real stand against the system, fought the system because they were being left out, whereas in places like Greece and Italy, they were actually embedded in the system, they were co-opted inside the system, and that was a fascinating explanation, but the premise was predicated on those productive up-and-coming classes fighting the fight, right? So the real question for me today for you is, we discussed many things. We discussed the power of big tech. We discussed the various polar forces in the United States sort of struggling against each other. But what I don't see in any of these scenarios is those up-and-coming productive classes that would actually fight the big fight. The people you see fighting the fight are the people who are, they seem to have no hope of winning. It's the ultra-liberals on one side, represented by the Democratic Party in the States, that don't seem to have a dog in the fight other than some ideological cause. I mean, they don't seem to be productive classes fighting the fight, i.e. sort of bringing that massive productive force with them. And the same thing for backcountry United States that voted for Donald Trump, and the same thing for sort of the fight against big tech, even though it's coming from both ends. Where is this, in your view? Where is this going? Because it doesn't seem to me that there is an analog to your books, or the people that brought down the robber barons, the people that fought Andrew Jackson type clientelism in the US, the people that fought the feudal lords of the UK, those be the lawyers, the traders, the shopkeepers. Where are those? It doesn't seem like there's an analog. So we kind of seem to be fighting this. You have David Cicilline and his crowd. You have Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and her crowd, and Bernie Sanders. But where are all those up-and-coming classes fighting the good fight to restore some balance there? Because there seems to be no balance at this point. And I don't know.
Fighting clientelism is a little bit different. I don't think that's quite our problem in the United States, but I think it is the case that the Democratic Party is actually quite fragmented internally, and they don't agree on an agenda, and they are divided on cultural issues and economic policy, and that's one of the reasons that they don't win elections more often than they do. I think especially because their cultural positions on race, gender, preference, are really not very popular with a lot of working class voters. But the real analog to what I was describing in that book would be a country like Brazil or India, a developing country that has lots of corruption, but it's modernizing. And the hope there is that you have both a business community and a civil society that gets mobilized against corruption. And, when the Lava Jato thing started in Brazil, whenever it was 7-8 years ago, I was hopeful that you could see a scenario unfold there like what happened in the United States, where there'd be a big popular mobilization against the pervasive corruption in Brazil. And then it just went bad because it had bad leadership, and the corruption was too deeply seated. So there's no automatic way out of these situations, but there's at least the possibility that if the leadership had been a little bit better, you could have made some progress in a country like Brazil.
There is a similar dynamic in the US. There's a similar structure that needs to be fought in the US, not clientelism, but state capture, really. You mentioned it, it's state capture, right? So who's going to fight that unless they have a very big productive force behind them, right? Who's going to fight the big corporates that actually ceaselessly lobby, right? Who's going to do that? It can't be just ideological, right? So that doesn't seem to exist, no?
Well, We'll see.
There are no warriors, you say.
Attitudes on antitrust have shifted 180 degrees over the last 3-4 years. People don't admire these big tech companies anymore the way they did. So there's some hope, I think, that public opinion will change on that. Whether it's enough, that's another story.
Well, with all these questions, there is one more. Yes? By the way, I want you to all, of course, admire Francis, but also look at this beauty there, completely led. Look at this, Francis.
Yeah,
Isn't it gorgeous?
Thank you very much. After congratulating Elena for this excellent event, I would like to go back to the problem of recognition and ask you a philosophical question. Do you think that the end of history has led to the emergence of Friedrich Nietzsche's Last Man, and how important the struggle for recognition is for this last man, actually? This is my question.
Yeah, so for those of you that have not read the book all the way to the end, the last few chapters of The End of History and The Last Man are about the last man. This is Nietzsche's last man, who was a democratic person, who doesn't have any pride or aspiration, is very flat, just as satisfied by consumption or by trivial, playing video games, whatever. And the argument I was making was that because people have thumos, they're not going to like this kind of life. And I think I had a line in the original article that said, if people can't struggle for justice, then they're going to struggle for injustice, because what people want is struggle, right? They want these higher goals. And I can sort of argue that that's what we're seeing right now, that you're living in the United States and Britain and a lot of European countries in a peaceful, stable, pretty prosperous society. They've got problems, but it's not that bad a situation, and yet people are resentful, they're angry, they're completely, disengaged from their government and so forth. And you say, well, what the hell's wrong with them? And I think it's part of this last man phenomenon, that people aren't satisfied being last men. They really want to, they really want to struggle. Okay.
So I have.
Well, it's 10.
Yeah. I have another question with the last minute. I don't have a watch, so I have to hold my technology for a good purpose. So what you just experienced is thought for action. What you just experienced is a safe space for all of us to express ourselves with our ideas, express all three elements of Plato's identity. To ask questions that may not have an answer. I started by what happened to the Byzantine Empire, then, and then what are we going to do to get to reduce Θυμός, and how can we engage and have and use technology for a better democracy? And when are we going to, where is the last man? And what were the other questions we have? Several other questions that I'm sure I forgot and missed. Oh, also several that came on my iPhone. Please forgive me if I didn't answer all of them. I didn't bring them on the stage. I want to thank you, first of all, for being very sincere and for being who you are, and giving openly and generously what talent you have, that you have invested in your education and learning and observation and resources and research and analysis through your books to us today. Thank you very, very much. I want to thank America, frankly, for helping us produce people like these, because it also has an extension of the educational system that allows us to have that. I want to thank you all being here today. I want to thank, if they hear me, these people that were sitting and standing and walking and questioning and generated the evolution of humankind and ideas to democracy and to oratorio way of operating, meftiki, whatever, who said meftiki before. So thank you very, very much. We are happy to see you, and you can ask some questions privately, but we have to leave the premises kind of like in the next 10 minutes, because it's an archaeological space and they need to close it for the public. Thanks for being here today. Thank you, Frank.